For decades, one of the oldest rules in modern war seemed almost unbreakable. If you want to survive air power, go underground. Dig deeper. Pour more concrete. Hide the missiles, the fuel, the command rooms, the stockpiles inside mountains, and force your enemy to waste time, money, and aircraft just trying to reach you. But what happens when the weapon designed to break that rule finally arrives? What we are seeing around Iran is not just another strike story. It is a warning that the age of underground safety may be starting to crack, and if that is true, the consequences go far beyond one mountain, one base, or even one country. To understand why this matters, you have to start with a simple truth about military power. Armies do not only fight with tanks, aircraft, missiles, or ships. They fight with assumptions. Assumptions about what is vulnerable, what is survivable, what can be rebuilt, and what will still be there after the first wave of attacks. For Iran, one of the most important assumptions for years has been that the deeper its most valuable assets go, the harder they become to destroy. That logic shaped the design of its underground infrastructure. It shaped the way Iran talked about deterrence, and it shaped the confidence behind its missile program. What made buried facilities so attractive was not mystery. It was math. Every extra meter of rock, every reinforced chamber, every tunnel entrance cut into a hillside changes the cost equation for the attacker. Suddenly, the enemy does not just need air superiority, it needs precision intelligence, specialized munitions, carefully timed sorties, and confidence that the strike will hit the right depth instead of just making an expensive crater on the surface. That is why underground warfare has become one of the defining contests of the modern era. One side digs, the other side builds a bomb that digs harder. That is where the GBU-72 enters the story, and this is the part many headlines miss. The GBU-72 is not important because it is simply big. A lot of bombs are big. It is important because it sits in a very specific place in the American toolbox. The U.S. Air Force described it as the Advanced 5K Penetrator, a 5,000-pound weapon developed to overcome hardened, deeply buried target challenges and designed for both fighter and bomber aircraft. In 2021, the Air Force said an F-15E Strike Eagle released the weapon during testing at Eglin Air Force Base, and officials said its lethality was expected to be substantially higher than similar legacy weapons, like the GBU-28. Source: that one detail tells you almost everything. This is not the heaviest penetrator in the arsenal, but it is a weapon designed to close a very dangerous gap between lighter bunker busters and the rare monsters reserved for the hardest targets. In war, that middle ground often matters more than the extremes. Think about what that means in practical terms. If a buried site is too tough for a smaller penetrator, but not important enough to justify deploying the most limited, specialized aircraft and munitions available, it can slip into a survivability zone. Not invulnerable, but inconvenient, costly to strike, difficult to prioritize, able to live another day. For a country like Iran, which has spent years hardening parts of its military and strategic infrastructure, that zone matters enormously. It is where deterrence breathes. It is where a missile force can survive the first attack and still threaten retaliation. It is where leadership can believe that even if the skies are lost, the war below ground is not. The significance of the GBU-72 is that it pressures that entire layer of thinking. It tells planners that some targets once considered awkward or inefficient to hit may now look much more reachable. Now bring Isfahan into the picture. Open-source reporting and institutional research have long pointed to Isfahan as a major node in Iran's strategic infrastructure. The Nuclear Threat Initiative describes the Isfahan missile complex as Iran's largest missile assembly and production site, built with North Korean and Chinese assistance in the late 1980s, with roles in propellant production, missile component manufacturing, and missile assembly. Source: that matters because when people hear underground site, they often imagine one hidden room. That is not how serious military infrastructure works. These systems are ecosystems. Storage, transport routes, assembly areas, fueling support, access points, security, deception measures, redundant routes, all spread across terrain that makes targeting harder and battle damage assessment uncertain. So when analysts talk about Isfahan, they are not just talking about one bunker. They are talking about a network. And in modern war, networks are far harder to kill than buildings. This is also where the public story gets more complicated. Some facts are fairly clear. Reuters reported in June 2025 that the International Atomic Energy Agency said entrances to tunnels at Iran's Isfahan site were hit in U.S. strikes, and those tunnels were used to store part of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. Source Reuters also reported earlier that experts said damage to some of Iran's buried infrastructure appeared limited, highlighting how hard it is to destroy deep underground facilities from the air. Source and satellite imagery analysis published by the Institute for Science and International Security in April 2026 said Iran had constructed makeshift roadblocks in front of all 3 tunnel entrances leading into the underground facility at the Isfahan nuclear complex, with all 3 tunnel portals still backfilled with dirt. Source: those are concrete indicators. Tunnels were important. Tunnel entrances were struck. Access points were later obstructed and hardened further. That tells us the underground layer is not a side story. It is the story. But here is the strategic insight that makes this bigger than a single news cycle. In campaigns against buried targets, the entrance is often not the target in the deepest sense. It is the symptom. You may hit the portal because it is visible, because it disrupts movement, because it seals equipment inside, because it delays recovery, or because it creates uncertainty about what remains usable deeper within the system. But unless the underground chambers themselves are collapsed, flooded, ignited, or rendered inaccessible long enough to become irrelevant, the defender may still have options. That is why some buried facilities seem to survive repeated headlines. Destruction and denial are not the same thing. A site can be damaged without being neutralized. A tunnel can be blocked without the whole complex being dead. And in war, time matters. If an attacker needs permanent elimination but only achieves temporary disruption, the defender can still claim strategic survival. This is exactly why bunker-busting weapons carry so much psychological weight. They do not just threaten material, they threaten confidence. For decades, governments have invested in underground infrastructure because it slows decision-making on the other side. It raises the cost of escalation. It protects high-value assets from routine precision strikes. It signals resilience. And most of all, it says to the enemy, even if you hit us first, you will not remove our ability to answer back. Once that belief is shaken, the damage spreads beyond the physical blast radius. Every tunnel entrance becomes suspect. Every mountain facility becomes a question mark. Every commander starts asking whether depth is still enough. That is the real danger for any military that built its deterrent around survivability underground. The problem is not just that one base can be struck. The problem is that all the other buried bases stop feeling guaranteed. There is also a historical pattern here, and it is older than many people realize. Air power has been driving militaries underground for generations. During the Cold War, hardened shelters, buried command posts, and protected storage sites became essential because fixed, visible infrastructure was simply too easy to destroy. Then came precision-guided weapons, better surveillance, better penetration, and better fusing. Every time defenders found a way to disappear into terrain, attackers built better ways to chase them there. The Gulf War accelerated that cycle because it made clear that conventional forces could be devastated from the air if they stayed exposed. Since then, countries that fear U.S. or Israeli strike capability have had every reason to dig deeper, disperse more widely, and design entire military doctrines around mobility plus concealment. Iran did not invent that playbook, but Iran refined it for a world in which missiles and drones could become the backbone of coercion. And that brings us to the real military question. What is underground in Iran that matters enough to trigger this kind of focus? The answer is not only nuclear infrastructure, though that gets the most global attention. The other answer is missiles, production chains, support equipment, and the means to keep launching even after an opening salvo. That is why Isfahan is so important in open-source analysis. It sits at the intersection of industrial capability, strategic signaling, and survivability. A missile force is not just about how many launchers a country owns. It is about whether those launchers can be sustained, rearmed, repaired, dispersed, and hidden long enough to keep imposing costs. If buried infrastructure helps preserve that cycle, then striking underground sites is not symbolic. It is a direct attempt to break the engine behind deterrence. Now step back and notice the campaign logic. In modern air campaigns, the order of targets usually tells you more than the press conferences do. First, you try to blind the enemy. Then you isolate command and control. Then you go after the systems that can still impose strategic pain. If buried missile networks become central targets, it usually means planners are moving beyond short-term punishment and toward long-term degradation. In plain English, the goal is no longer just to send a message. The goal is to reduce what the other side can physically do next week, next month, and maybe next year. That is why the debate over penetrators matters so much. A weapon like the GBU-72 is not just a piece of hardware. It is a sign that the campaign may be shifting from surface disruption toward deeper denial. Still, it is critical to separate confirmed fact from informed inference. Confirmed fact: the U.S. Air Force says the GBU-72 was built for hardened, deeply buried targets and tested from the F-15E. Confirmed fact: the IAEA said tunnel entrances at Isfahan were hit in 2025. Confirmed fact: satellite imagery later showed tunnel entrances at the Isfahan underground complex obstructed and reinforced. Analysis begins when people claim exactly what was inside, how much was destroyed, whether specific missile stocks were lost, or how much deeper the underground chambers extend. That part is much harder to prove quickly, especially when governments have reasons to exaggerate success or minimize damage. And that uncertainty is not a side detail. It is one of the core weapons in the information war. If an attacker wants deterrence, it benefits from making the target look penetrable. If the defender wants deterrence, it benefits from making recovery look easy and survival look intact. There is another layer to this that matters for American viewers in particular. The value of a mid-tier penetrator is not just about physics. It is about operational flexibility. If a weapon can be delivered by aircraft already common in regional planning, that changes tempo. It shortens response times. It reduces dependence on a tiny pool of unique platforms. It widens the menu of possible targets. And in sustained conflict, logistics often matter more than spectacle. The flashiest weapon is not always the most useful one. Sometimes the most consequential weapon is the one commanders can use again and again and again without redesigning the whole mission around it. That is one reason why so much attention goes to the delivery platform as well as the bomb itself. An F-15E carrying a serious penetrator is not just a tactical image. It is a statement about scalability. Iran, of course, has not been passive in this contest. Buried infrastructure is usually paired with deception, redundancy, and rapid repair plans. Multiple access roads, alternate portals, camouflage, support areas made to look ordinary, and decoy facilities are all part of the survival package. If one entrance is blocked, another may matter. If one route is watched, another may move at night. If one chamber is compromised, what matters most may already be elsewhere. This is why battle damage assessment for underground targets is notoriously difficult. You can photograph the outside of a mountain. You can estimate blast effects. You can monitor vehicle movement. But proving what happened deep inside in real time is much harder. That uncertainty buys the defender strategic breathing room, and it forces the attacker to spend more intelligence, more sorties, and more political capital if it wants certainty instead of headlines. And there is a geopolitical consequence that extends beyond Iran. If the lesson of this period is that underground infrastructure is becoming less safe against advanced precision penetrators, other states will not ignore it. They will adapt in one of three ways. They will dig deeper. They will disperse more widely. Or they will shift toward mobile systems that are harder to find in the first place. In other words, the answer to a better bunker buster is not surrender. It is another round of the same arms race between concealment and penetration. That cycle has shaped military innovation for decades, and it is now colliding with an era of drones, persistent surveillance, and rapidly improving strike accuracy. The mountain is no longer just fighting the bomb. It is fighting satellites, analytics, pattern detection, and the possibility that every truck, every berm, every reopened portal is being watched. So where does this leave us? The biggest takeaway is not that underground sites are suddenly obsolete. They are not. Buried infrastructure still complicates targeting, slows escalation, and preserves capability better than leaving everything in the open. The bigger takeaway is that the margin of safety appears to be narrowing. If weapons like the GBU-72 can reliably pressure the layer between shallow shelters and the hardest underground fortresses, then many facilities once considered durable may now sit in a more dangerous category than before. Not easy targets, but no longer comfortable ones. And in deterrence, discomfort matters. Once planners stop trusting a sanctuary, they start changing behavior. They move assets sooner. They disperse more often. They reveal themselves more during movement. They make mistakes. That may be the most important story unfolding around Isfahan. Not simply whether one strike succeeded or failed, but whether the idea of protected depth is being eroded in real time. If that erosion continues, then the strategic map changes. Missile forces become more fragile. Industrial support nodes become more exposed. Negotiating leverage weakens. Crisis behavior becomes more unpredictable because leaders who feel their protected assets are no longer protected may choose to escalate faster, not slower. History shows that when secure rear areas stop feeling secure, wars can become more dangerous very quickly. And that is why this story deserves more attention than a typical weapons explainer. It sits at the intersection of engineering, deterrence, intelligence, and geopolitics. One bomb does not end a campaign. One strike does not settle a war. But sometimes a weapon reveals that an old assumption has expired. For years, Iran's underground infrastructure represented a promise. You may reach our skies, but you will not easily reach what matters most beneath them. The growing focus on penetrators, tunnel entrances, and buried networks suggests that promise is being tested harder than ever. The mountain still matters. The tunnels still matter. Depth still matters. But the most important change may be that none of those things sound as absolute as they once did. And in military strategy, the moment certainty starts to vanish is often the moment the real shift begins. If you want more deep documentary-style breakdowns on the weapons, strategy, and hidden logic behind modern conflicts, subscribe now and tell me in the comments. Do bunker buster strikes change the balance, or do underground networks still give Iran a real deterrent edge?